Hi, I'm Professor Green, and today we'll be talking about Chapter 6, Organizational Ethics. This is a key chapter for this course, right, because the course is titled Ethics and Sustainability. And so now this chapter really ties together a lot of the ideas from our textbook and brings it back to ethics at its core. So let's go ahead and hop into it. The case study that we're going to be studying in this chapter is the case from Equifax. So it's a recent one from 2017. If you remember correctly, that there was a huge data breach that 145 million Americans their information was stolen, that there were hackers that logged into the Equifax database and they stole their names, addresses, and social security numbers. And besides just Americans, Equifax saw this happening actually slowly from 2011 to 2016, that 15 million British citizens had their information stolen from Equifax. Why this went wrong, besides just the data breach, is that as this information was coming out, the top executives of Equifax started to learn about this information, and before it hit mainstream media, they went to go sell shares of their stock of Equifax because they predicted that with this information hitting mainstream media that the stock price would very quickly go down. And not only did they go to sell, but the top lawyer within Equifax, he approved the sale of those shares, right? Because anytime a senior leader within any organization goes to sell their own shares, it needs to be approved by the lawyer for these circumstances, right? To make sure that there's no insider trading or there's not any decision coming up that would affect necessarily the sale price of the stock. And the lawyer actually did approve it, and he did know that this information was going to be coming out a couple of days later. So obviously, executives were guilty of not doing anything first when they first saw that something was being done wrong. They kind of were caught in their boots, and so they didn't move to make a change very quickly. And then they also were selling stocks, so they obviously went to court and were convicted for wrongdoings. There was a delay in going public with the issue, and as we dive deeper into this situation, we see that really only one person was responsible for the security of the data, which has changed significantly, not only in Equifax, but in many organizations since then. So you want to make sure that the data, there are checks and balances, that it's not just up to one person to secure hundreds of millions of types of information for one organization. And the interesting part that we'll get to as well is that in the end, this data actually never showed up on the black market, on the resale market. We never really saw what the hackers did with this information, but at the end of the day, that's not really the problem, right? The problem is that A, there was a security breach, and B, the executives of Equifax didn't do anything except sell their stock days before the news actually erupted. So let's go ahead and get into this chapter and understand better why that's a big problem. So let's talk about the key learning objectives. The first one is classifying an organization's culture and ethical climate, also known as their dynamic. So understanding what their dynamic is and how you can read an organization's culture and ethical situation. The next one is recognizing ethics challenges across multiple functions of business. The next one is creating effective ethics policies and identifying responsible individuals to become an organization's ethics and compliance officer. So how do you actually enforce an ethical code? Number 4, constructing successful ethics reporting mechanisms, ethics training programs, and similar safeguards. So again, guidelines and actual measurable things that you can record and talk about year after year when it comes to ethics. And number 5, understanding how to conduct business ethically in the global marketplace. Because, again, ethics, as we've spoken about in this course, is different potentially from country to country. Let's go ahead and hop into the next slide. Corporate culture and ethical climates. So corporate culture, one of my favorite topics, is a blend of ideas, customs, traditional practices, company values, and shared meanings. It's there to help define normal work behavior for everyone who works in the organization. As Dean Smith says here at CBA, it's how we do things around here, right? So, and every organization has a different and unique corporate culture. The last bullet point on the slide here says that nearly twice as many employees observe misconduct by coworkers in weak ethical culture companies. So if your ethical culture is weak, if it's small, if there's not a big culture of supporting ethical decisions, then very quickly employees individually will start to make bad ethical decisions. And so this chapter talks a lot about how our own personal values and our own moral character are important for the employee. Because once we know what those are, what our own values are, it's harder for the organization's culture to affect our own values. So if you don't agree with the company's culture or their ethical values, then you can identify that very, very quickly and identify that gap. So, but if you see decisions being made within the organization um, that are not ethical to your particular values, then you can very quickly say something and identify that and either leave the organization or report that to someone who might be interested in that type of information. So let's hop into the next slide and get more deeper into this topic. Let's identify or define the ethical climate. This is the unspoken understanding among the employees of what is and was not acceptable behavior. It's based on the expected standards and norms. And there are often multiple climates or subclimates that can exist within one organization. So these are subtle hints that are approved and what is forbidden within an organization. Two other case studies that they bring up in this chapter, are also really relevant. So the first one is Pfizer, where they rebranded a drug and then they charged 17 times higher in 2012. And so obviously someone in that organization was making an ethical decision that they wanted to just make a lot of money. And even though the drug was the same as the earlier version, they just gave it a new name and a new marketing pitch, they charged a whole lot more money for it, right? And so if you see things like that happening in your organization, it's your job to really question, is this the right way? Is this the right thing that we should be doing? The other case study that we talked about in this chapter is the Wells Fargo case. And this happened here in 2016, where Wells Fargo opened up 1.5 million credit card accounts without the person's knowledge. And there were fees and debt collectors that had to then follow up on these open accounts. And so it became a huge mess. And in the end, again, just like the Equifax, not that many people were actually hurt because a handful of people had, potentially future loans not approved because they had these credit cards open up. But for the most part, nobody was really hurt by these open accounts. But the idea that Wells Fargo was actually going to open up an account for you without your knowledge doesn't make any ethical sense. So again, these are things that happen within an organization. And when you see things happening that you think potentially are unethical, it can be a subtle hint to what the organization is, how it's functioning as a whole. Let's talk about the components of ethical climates. This is how there are three major ethical criteria that we're going to talk about, and this is how each approach, how each can how each can approach versions of moral dilemmas. So let's go through the first one, egoism. This is a self-centered approach. The focus here is on self-interest. If it's an organization, it's only on your company interest. So again, if you're Pfizer and you're charging 17 times more for a product, obviously you're really focused on bringing in more money for your organization. And the society is that there's economic efficiency within the society if we're focused on that, and if it's an egoistic approach. The next ethical criteria is benevolence. So this is concern or your approach for others. And the focus of an individual person would be on friendship. If within an organization, there's more about team interest, more about groups and working together to do things. And if we're talking about a society and the ethical climate of society, then there's a lot of social responsibility included in the society. And you can see that here in the United States because CSR has been growing exponentially over the last decade or two. And so I would say that the United States is probably in a place of benevolence at this stage. And then the last ethical criteria here is a principle or the integrity approach. And the focus, if you're an individual, would be on your personal morality. If this is an organization that we're talking about, then the organization is really focused on their own company rules and procedures. What type of organization do they want to be? And if society is working on this integrity approach, then they're talking a lot about laws and professional codes, right? What type of society do they want to be? What type of country do they want to be? What type of laws and codes do they want to have? So let's talk about now business ethics across organizational functions. And this slide is an introduction slide to the next slides, to slides 7, 8, 9, and 10, and 11. We're going to be talking about all these different subdivisions within business. The main topic here is, or the main bullet point is that business operations can be highly specialized, right, leading to ethical challenges related to those particular functional areas. Professional ethical standards may conflict with the ethical standards within the organization. So maybe the accounting group will say that it's the right thing to do, but the finance group might say that it's not the right thing to do. So obviously there might be a discrepancy. We're going to go ahead and talk about this. The first one we're going to talk about is accounting. So here it's critically important. This is a critically important right component of every business firm, right? As we spoke about already in this course, that we want to make sure that we have clear balance statements and really understand what the bottom line is when it comes to our numbers. The financial records must be audited by a certified professional accounting firm. That since the Enron scandal in 2002, this has become mandatory for all organizations in the United States. And that the requirements of the accounting function are responsibility, public interest, integrity, objectivity and independence, and due care. As we see very often, that sometimes accounting ethics, there can be a conflict of interest, that there's a conflict with self-interest of the accounting firm and the interests of others in the shareholders and the public. So PwC, right, is a huge organization that does a lot of accounting audits. And so they got into a lawsuit a couple of years ago saying that the auditors needed to deliver fair and accurate accounting statements, right? And so that the auditors needed to be fair, but not necessarily always listen to what the shareholders wanted to see when it came to seeing their prices or their accounting, their budgets all inflated. Let's talk about financial ethics. Here we talk about where responsibilities, these are the responsibilities to manage the firm's assets, and they're raising capital. So hopefully you should know this after 3 years of studying business. Some examples of ethical issues are the Barclays was accused of fraud, so that they convinced the Qatari bank to make payments to inflate the bank's financial condition during the financial crisis. So they were doing some fancy numbers. And then the Royal Bank of Scotland scandal, also, this was all about the sale of a toxic mortgage, backed securities. So they were selling securities where the mortgages were not certain, or where they were not 100% honest about what those mortgages looked like in those securities. So when we talk about financial ethics, as Alexi said when we had our guest speaker this semester, self-regulation is really the best path for ethical compliance, right? And so we want to make sure as we go through and we do our financial deals that we're really truly trying to regulate ourselves, because it is hard a lot of the times for shareholders, for stakeholders, for auditors to really understand how the deal goes through. And so if anything unethical does go through and people find out, it's not a good situation. And so at this time and place, that there truly aren't many auditors when it comes to financial deals. So we want to make sure that we're self-regulating most of the time. Let's talk about marketing ethics. This is, again, a definition of marketing is, so we're all on the same page, advertising, distributing, and selling products or services. There are issues in marketing ethics where they emphasize honesty and transparency in advertising many times. So the example that they gave was with Outcome Health, and this was an advertising example. This is where they installed and ran video monitors in physicians' offices, and they charged these pharmaceutical companies for videos that in the end never really ran, and they inflated data about the success of these ads. So complete fraud, right? And this is considered a marketing fraudulent incident because it was all about the marketing team creating those ads and then delivering data on the fruitfulness of those ads. So here, this is regulated a lot by individual organizations. One of the biggest ones is the AMA, the American Marketing Association, and they have a code of ethics, which is really important. They say, do no harm, foster trust, and embrace ethical values. And I'd say many organizations in the United States are members of the AMA. Let's go ahead and talk about information technology ethics, one of my favorites because I worked in IT for so long. So this can involve a handful of different episodes or opportunities for going beyond ethical correct choices. The first one is invasions of privacy, right? We talked a lot about that a lot in this course. What is privacy? The collection and storage of and access to personal and business information. So again, that Equifax case, that was a technology ethical issue. Confidentiality of electronic mail communication. So again, being able to hack into an employee's mail, or Google being able to access our mail, is that ethical or not? Copyright protection, recording software, music, and intellectual property, right? The music industry has talked about this a lot in the last couple of decades, right? What is ethical? Can we just stream everything on Spotify for a low-cost price? Should we force people to buy music at a higher price, individual records, etc.? And then cyberbullying is also a big ethical issue when it comes to IT. And then there are a handful of other ones that I could talk to you about, but we'll just focus on these 5 for today. The example that they give here is VTech, where they collected personal information from children without parental consent. So VTech, right, is a company that produces and manufactures toys, and a lot of these are gamified toys, and so sometimes this information, these toys collect information about from the child, and it isn't like a tablet where you have to typically authorize information. BTech just went in and easily allowed children to enter in that information and didn't tell the parents that they were doing that. And so 6 million children's personal information was gathered, including name, gender, and birth date. So again, really important because VTech had a really big problem when they were caught collecting this information without the parental consent. Let's move on to the last type of ethical place, a place where ethical values can come up, and this is in supply chain. And we'll talk about supply chain a lot in this course. We'll have a whole chapter on it, and a lot of you have written about supply chain in your business ethics analysis papers. This is also the end of part 1 of this chapter. When we talk about supply chain, this is, again, the production and operations functions needed to create a product or a service. There are issues in supply chain ethics that emphasize integrity, value, and loyalty in business dealings. Those terms now sound familiar now that we've worked through our 5 different areas of business. And the example that they talk about here is where Kobe Steel Limited misled their customers. This is where they falsified quality documents on copper metal orders, and they covered up evidence. So they were creating copper and saying that because they have different increments of how quality the copper is, and they were actually selling the copper at a high, what they were saying was a higher quality than what it's actually that they were selling. And then people started to detect that this was a problem, they started to cover up the evidence that they were sending out product of lower quality and charging higher prices. So obviously not good. And one of the institutes that monitors this type of information is the ISM, the Institute for Supply Management. They have some principles and standards, and therefore key points are to avoid impropriety, be responsible, protect confidentiality, and follow the law. Great. So thank you so much for talking to me about part 1 of chapter 6. Let's go ahead and hop into chapter 2. Again, this is Professor Green.